Yo, Chuck.
What the chuck is up, YouTube? In this video, I'm going to go over Leetcode 7, reverse integer. So as you may imagine, we're just going to take a number and reverse it. This is going to be a little bit trickier if the number is negative, but we can just do a simple test for that, and it's not too bad. The constraint we have is our number needs to fall in between this range, and that also is easy to implement. We cannot store the range, however, in a variable. That is just one of the constraints in this problem. So typically the way people solve this problem is they take a number and convert it into a string, then they take that string, convert it into an array, then they reverse that array, and then they combine those values back into a number. Now it's reversed. So I'm going to show you a bunch of different ways to do that, but then I'm also going to show you the best solution to my knowledge, which we can actually reverse a number just using math operations. And of course, that's going to be much faster. Okay, let's hop into the code. Sweet, so here is my function. I just copied it off of Leetcode, and I'm passing in -123, and I need to reverse this. So the first thing I want to do is just return the number to make sure it's firing. So let's run this code. And we return the number as we would expect. That's good. So I need to test, is this number less than 0? And if it is, then I'll make a variable called negative, and I will set it initially to false, but I'm going to say if the number we pass is less than 0, then negative will be true. And this is just to make sure that I have the correct value at the very end. I can make it negative, right? Okay, so from here, what I want to do is convert this value to a string, so then I can use some reverse methods to actually reverse the number. So I'm going to say x equals x dot toString. Now if I do that and return, well, I got to return x. Return x. If I do that, you can see I have now a string number. You can tell it's a string because it's no longer yellow in the console. Okay, so I actually want to get rid of that negative sign, so I'm going to make this an absolute. So I'll say math absolute, and then I'll pass in that x right here, just like that. And now my string number is no longer, it doesn't have that negative anymore, okay? So like I said, we can't actually reverse this string until we make it an array. So I need to make this an array. I'm going to do that with the split method. Recall that I must make this an array because strings are immutable, which means that you can't change their value at an index, but arrays are mutable and you can change their value at a specific index. So now that I've converted this string to an array, what does it look like? It looks like that. It's just a array of digits, and each of those digits is a string value. Okay, so there's a bunch of different ways we can reverse. Easiest way is using the built-in reverse method in JavaScript. Just like that, and now we have reversed our array. So now we need to basically bring this back to a number form. So I'm going to use the join method here and say join, just like that. And now I've joined this number, but it's still a string, okay? So to make it a number again, I'm going to use the number object and just wrap everything that I just created right there. Save that guy and then run it. You can tell it's a number now because it's yellow. So now I have my number, right? Okay, so if my number is negative, I want to make sure to times it by -1 to make it negative again at the end. Because remember, we use math absolute value here to get the absolute value. So we need to change it back if it was negative. So I'll say if negative equals true, then I want x times equals -1, because that is going to be my number times itself times -1. So let's see what happens. So now we are returning a reversed -321. But recall from the problem statement, we have to fall in this range right here of numbers, but we cannot store that 32-bit integer number as a variable. So what I'm going to do is back in my code, I can say return x is less than math.pow, pass in 2 to the 31st power, and x is greater than math.pow -2, and then pass in the 31st power. So I'm going to put this all in parentheses like this, and then I'm basically going to use a ternary operator here. So if this condition is true, this is basically saying if x falls in the appropriate range that they've dictated in the problem statement back here, right? So if x falls in this range, that's good. We can just return x. And the way you do that with a ternary operator is you use the question mark, and you would just say return x. So imagine this question mark is like an if statement, right? And then your else statement is going to be a colon, and then you're going to pass in whatever happens if this isn't true, if this statement isn't true right here. So you would just pass in 0 because the problem statement says, hey, return 0 if your number does not fall in that range. So now if I run the code, I still get 321, right? What would happen if I passed in an absurdly large number like this? I should get 0, right? Or I guess this would be a crazy large negative number. Let's try with a very large big number. I also get 0. So that's what we want for our test case. So that looks good. Let's run this code and see what happens in Leetcode. So I'm going to put it back in here, paste it, submit. Looks good. So it definitely works. Okay, so that was one way to reverse a number or an integer. I want to show you different ways of reversing that doesn't rely on this built-in reverse method. So what I'm actually going to do here is just get rid of this. Let's return x at this point so I can show you what it looks like. Let's get rid of this. Return x. Oh, we have a syntax error because I removed a parentheses. All right. We actually want to convert this back into an array. Right now the number is just a number because I'm using that number wrapper. Let's delete this code and make math absolute value of x to string, and then we're going to convert this string of numbers, the string number, into an array. I'm going to use the split method for that. And now we're back to where we were, unreversed. So we want to reverse these numbers, and I want to show you different ways we can do that. So a fun way to do that might be to make 2 pointers. I'll say left equals 0 and right is going to be x dot length minus 1. Because recall x right now is an array. So x dot length minus 1 would be index 2, and then obviously 0 would be index 0 right here. So I'm basically making 2 index values, and I'm going to use them to swap each other. So I'll say while left is less than right, we're going to perform a swap. You can do this by making a temp variable, storing the value of x at index left, setting x at index left equal to x at index right. So I'm just setting these different index values equal to each other, or the digit at that respective index equal to each other. And then I'm going to set x at index right equal to temp. So set this equal to temp. And now, because you imagine I've got those 2 pointers at either ends of my digits, so I've got a pointer here and then I've got a pointer here, I need to have them basically meet together. So I'm going to say left plus plus and then right minus minus. Okay, now we're going to return x again. Let's see what happens. You can see we've reversed it, right? So instead of using that built-in reverse method that JavaScript gives us, we've just basically just done the same thing, but we've used a while loop with 2 pointers. And from here, I can do the same thing that I did before. So I'll say x equals x.join. So I'm going to turn this array back into a string right there. And then I'm just going to wrap this in the number object. And you can see we have our number. Let's get rid of this return statement. So we have this if conditional down here. Okay, if I return that, that looks good. Let's run this in Leetcode. Back to our submissions. Put this guy in there, run it. And that also is valid. So that looks good. Okay, I want to show you another way to do the same exact thing we just did. We're no longer going to use the reverse method. We just use the while loop to basically perform that swap. You can actually perform that swap with a for loop too. Let me show you that. So we'll make a variable called I is less than x.length, because remember x is still in an array at this point. And while that is true, I'm going to increment I. I'm going to get rid of these index values of left and right since we don't need them anymore. Okay, so just to recall, I'm going to return x and go back to my console and run it. And you can see this is what my x value is right now. So I just need to reverse this number. So the way to do that with a for loop, we can make a temp variable and set it to the very beginning digit at index 0 initially. So I'm going to say temp equals I at index, or x at index I. And then I'm going to set the x at index I equal to x at x.length minus 1 minus I. So what this is saying is, initially I'm going to basically set this index I to the very first value, or the first digit, right? And then I'm also going to have a pointer pointing to the very last digit, okay? So this is the same thing we just did with the while loop, but now you can see my variables, they look a little bit different. I'm not using index left and index right. I'm using index I, and basically x.length minus 1 minus I is my two index values. So I need to just perform that swap, just like we were doing. Actually, let's do it like this. X.length minus 1 minus I. And then to perform the swap, minus 1 minus I equals temp. Now, if we run this code, you can see we are reversing our number. But wait, we actually didn't reverse it. We just kept it the same, because didn't we input -123? So notice here on my for loop, let's console log what my value of x is each iteration. I want to show you something. So if I run this code, you can see I'm at 1, 2, 3. Then I'm at 3, 2, 1. Hey, that's actually reversed. Then I'm at 3, 2, 1. Hey, that's actually reversed. But then I return -1, 2, 3. What happened there? So if you imagine we're doing this for loop while I is less than x.length, that's actually twice as many iterations as we actually need to perform this swap. So what I need to do here is use math.floor. And when I take my x.length, I want to divide that by 2, because I only need half the operations to perform those swaps that are the length of x, right? Because if I perform so many iterations that there are digits in x, I'm actually going to reverse too many times. And the number, as you can see, is not even reversed because I did too many swaps. So I need to do half as many swaps. Now, when we return the number, it's reversed, okay? So that's pretty cool. There's actually even niftier ways to perform swaps. Let's run this code real fast though, make sure it works. In Leetcode, we'll come in here to submissions. All right, gonna paste this bad boy. Yada, yada, yada. It works. Okay, cool. So this works. Let me show you the best way to swap. So JavaScript introduced an easier swapping syntax. So instead of this, what we're gonna do is just make an array bracket like so. I'm going to pass in my x at index I, and then also my x at index x.length minus 1 minus I, just like we did. And then I'm going to say equals and use the brackets again. And then I'm going to just reverse the position of this x at index x, or x at index I should say, and then this one right here. So watch how I do this. X.length minus I minus 1, comma, x at index I. So these are actually saying the same exact thing, but you can tell this syntax is like a one-liner and it looks a lot more clean. So let's delete this. Now if I run the code, whoops, if I run the code on my terminal, I get the same answer. Let me run this in Leetcode. Submissions. Okay. Here we go. Plug it in. And it still works. Excellent. So that is a little trick. You'll see people use this logic. So if you've never encountered it before, it might look kind of intimidating, but it's basically performing that same swap logic we wrote right here. So those are the same thing. Okay, now that I've showed you how to reverse and how everyone pretty much reverses an integer by converting it to a string and then converting it to an array and then converting that array into a reverse and then combining that back into a number, I'm going to show you how to do the same thing but with math operations, and this is much faster. All right, to reverse an integer just using math equations or operations, first I'm going to delete all this code we just wrote. Then I'm going to comment out this return statement. And I'm going to make a variable, and this is going to be the variable that we return. I'm going to call it output. Initially, I'm going to set that to 0. So what I'm basically going to do is grab the last digit of whatever we passed in on x and then put it into output. So output is going to be initially 0. Then the next iteration is going to be equal to 3. Then the next iteration is going to be 3, 2. Then 3, 2, 1. So I'm just grabbing the value from x and I'm putting it into output. Okay, so I'm going to make a while loop to perform this operation. I'll say while x does not equal 0, perform some logic. So what I want to do here is obviously I'm going to decrease x by its digit or the last digit it has every time, and then I'm going to put that digit into output. So the first thing I'm going to do is say output equals itself times 10, okay? So the reason I'm doing that is because if you imagine you've got a number, say 13, and then you multiply 13 by 10, that gives you 130. If you multiply 130 by 10, you get 1300. If you multiply 1300 by 10, you get 13,000. Notice how by multiplying by 10, we add that 0 on the end, which is what we want because we want to put numbers into the output, all right, from x. So from here, I initially start at 0. So if I multiply 0 by 0, or multiply 0 by 10 rather, you just get 0. So what I'm going to do is say plus x modulo 10. Okay, what does x modulo 10 mean? Modulo is just a reducer. So for instance, if my x value, it's initially 1, 2, 3. If I perform x modulo 10, I'm going to be left with 3. If I had a number, say 564, and I did 564 modulo 10, I'm left with 4. If I did a number, say 760 modulo 10, I'd be left with 0. Notice how by using modulo 10, we can get the last digit on each of these numbers. So by doing x modulo 10, I'm just grabbing that numbered value, right? So 3, for instance, and then I'm adding it to output. So output times 10 is still 0 because output is initially 0, but then I add the x modulo 10, which is 3. Now my output is 3 times 10 equals 30, and then I'm going to add x modulo 10, which is now going to be 2, and I'm going to have 32. So you can kind of see how I'm just adding those values from x one at a time back into output. But now I have to obviously decrement x somehow, otherwise this will be an infinite loop that'll never stop running. So I'm going to say x equals x minus, and we have to subtract that modulo 10 value, right? So I'm going to say x modulo 10, just like this. Okay, so I'm subtracting that 3, and then I'm subtracting that 2 and that 1. And then we also need to get rid of the 0 place, because if I just subtract, if my x is 1, 2, 3, and I just subtract 3, it'll be 120. So how do I get rid of that 0? To get rid of the 0, we divide by 10. So if I divide by 10, now x equals 12. And then I subtract that 2 again. So I say 12 minus x modulo 10, which is 2. That gives me 10. And then how do I get rid of this 0? Well, I divide by 10. And now I have 1. Okay, so I need to divide by 10 here. So let's delete these commented out code, and then we'll return output. See what happens. If I run this, we get our number reversed, which is really awesome. So basically, you just got to wrap your head around what you're doing, but it's pretty easy once you kind of grasp, like, oh, modulo 10 just grabs that last digit, and then I need to decrement x. And then multiplying by 10 gives me another zeros place, and then dividing by 10 just does the opposite, okay? So let's take this and uncomment out our range that's acceptable, and then instead of x now, we're going to put in output. So I'll say output is less than that, and then output is greater than that. We want to return output. Okay, let's run this in Leetcode and see what happens. Submissions, plug it in here. This is going to be much faster, I imagine. If I submit, we'll see what it says. Yes, okay. Well, that's not it. All right, 80th percentile, not too bad. I was messing around with it last night and I got it to like 99th percentile. So usually math, a good rule of thumb is like if you can perform one of these algorithms just using math, it's probably going to be faster. But yes, that is how to reverse a number or an integer just using math operations. Pretty powerful once you kind of figure out how this works. Okay, I hope you guys found this video enjoyable and valuable. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.